all this stuff into, you can organize this stuff a lot better. Let's create a copy of our 3 terrains that are grouped. And let's go and maximize this view. Let's move this there and switch the sides. Switch the sides. And now let's take both of them, create copies, and move these up there. So we copied these terrains and we already fill up the space here in the background pretty neatly. Let's try another test render with that. And it starts to look like something. Now we have still some room in the background right there that we can fill up as well just by copying these terrains and move them there in the background. Now let me just check my notes for a second. If you have some questions, Paul. Yep. Okay, now let's fill these far areas in the background right there. And not these two, this one, and this one. Okay, and let's maximize this one and make this larger. Now the perfect size for one of these enlarged terrains would be the same size of our 4 main terrains. So let's make it a tiny bit larger and move it into place. Okay. Now we have really filled up that area and that space in the background, and that's exactly what we wanted. Now what we can do is to optimize the background terrains a tiny bit. And there we can go in and delete some ecosystems because these will eat away some memory as well. And just let's keep the tech layer 1 ecosystem for the background far back terrains. So let's create a test render here. And yeah, this fills up the background space very nicely. Um, um, I'm not exactly sure what she means. Mm, well, I haven't added any extra lights. So it's only sunlight right now. We will also we won't add any additional lights to the scene since we are going for a straight daylight scene. So, but we will go into the sunlight settings later. So that's basically how I set up the terrains for the for the scene. And you are enlarging the scenes when you do so. Since it's still 4K, will there be blurriness or pixelation if you mean the terrains, I guess? Yes, of course. When you have a terrain that's set up like 4K and the underlying map, the picture you will use for the terrain is only like 1K, you will immediately see and notice that the quality isn't there. And that's what I used earlier when I showed the difference between 4 and 8K. And this one is the 4K terrain. And this one is the 8K terrain. And the lines here are much more defined and clear compared to the 4K version where it becomes, like you say, a little bit blurry. So when working with height fields, the larger the resolution of your picture, the better the quality will be in the render, and that's that's how it is. And um, the downside is the larger the image file, like 8K, the more heavy the load on view handling these terrains. That's why for this presentation I kept the terrains at a 4K resolution. And so View has an easier time to handle what we are trying to show here. You mean the two I wrongly copied in the new layer? When I delete them, they are gone. So they're not in the background or still in the memory or something. Yeah. What you can do to save some resources when test rendering and trying to look at something specific, just click on these objects that aren't needed. So you cross them out so they won't appear in your test render. That will speed things up probably. So that's what I constantly do when checking on certain detailed parts of my scene. And just to make these test renders quicker. So yeah, that's our terrains. And if there aren't any more questions regarding this part, I will move on to the camera setup. Now, Chris Jonas has another question regarding vectors. Do you want to read it? Well, objects will probably always have a certain amount of polygons, and so the closer you go into the scene, or the closer you go to the objects, you will notice quality drops depending on how dense the polygon count of the object is. When it comes to the terrains, you can create terrains in Vue, the so-called procedural terrains. These are created through vectors, and these will have pretty much unlimited detail. The quality of the terrain is rendered by checking out how close the camera is to the terrain and calculating what detail is needed depending on how close the camera is to the terrain. But that may be something for a different show, since we're doing standard terrains today. And like I said earlier, you are probably able to create these tech-like SciFi pattern circuit board shapes within Vue via the function editor and vector nodes and functions, but it would take quite some time to set something like this up properly. And so I have to answer your question with a yes and a no. Okay, so let's move on to the camera setup, and let's do something just to make sure. Let's save this as progress, and let's go into the camera. Now, for the camera, I have some notes again. Okay, the first thing we should do is to give our camera a new color, because if we leave it green or a gray, we don't see it very good in our scene. So if we switch back to gray, it's hardly visible, especially when the scene is filled with tons of stuff. And for me, the orange color works pretty well. Then let's deactivate this one, even though we don't need this feature, or we don't work with this feature. And then let's try to apply some settings and a position to align the position of the camera to the position we have in our final image. And almost done. And that's basically the point of view we have in our final scene. And a question for you guys, maybe you can help me with this. Now, where does the height in the object main camera tab orientate itself? Does it orientate itself on the ground plane or something else? Because the height we have set up in the object position is different, or it was different. It just changed to the same value. Now this is always a little bit confusing to me, because some of my scene files have different values in these two fields, and I'm I'm really not sure how this can be. But anyway, yeah, if we use this lock, it will orientate on the closest object under the camera. We can even define which objects to ignore. Still, in some cases it's behaving a little weird when I work on my other projects. So that's our camera, and for a more cinematic look, we go with a different aspect ratio of 70 millimeter. And here we go. And this looks much more cinematic. And let's do a quick render. Get an impression. Now this works pretty good, but what I noticed is that we definitely need another filler terrain in this area right over here on the left. And for that, let's just copy one of our terrains in the far back and place it somewhere around here. Another quick test. And yeah, this starts to look like something. All right, so that's our camera settings and the complete setup of the terrain for our scene. And what Vue is doing when you use the same terrain over and over again, I think it's using a technique called instancing, and it's basically using all the terrain data once and not separate for each copy of the terrain, because that would eat up the memory in no time. So that's certainly very efficient from Vue, and helps to streamline the rendering and the handling of all the memory that's going through the creation of these scenes. And that pretty much concludes our terrain setup and camera setup. Our next step would be to add buildings to the scene. Now, any more questions? Yeah. All right. Now let's take a look at the buildings. For that, I have a scene I have saved to fall back to. And this will unfortunately load a little bit. Did you use water for the rest of the terrain? The water in this scene is used for the ground plane, so it stretches into infinity, so to say. And I haven't used any reflective or water material directly on the terrain. The reason why the water is shining through one of the shining through the base terrain is because I placed it a little bit lower or beneath the ground plane. So we have some some water coming through there, just to yeah, get some variation into this area. And here you can immediately see that we named our terrains properly and our groups. Now, what's missing here is the large terrain extension for the background, but that should be okay for now. I can only recommend you to always name your layers and groups so you have always a complete look at what you're doing, and if you need to change something, it's definitely helpful to have different names for stuff, not just numbers. Now let's create a layer for the front buildings. Let's keep view open and start DAS Studio. Now the buildings we are using in this scene in general are buildings from Stonemason, a very well-known artist, 3D artist that has some really cool 3D packages on in the DAS shop. And the objects we will use for the front objects are part of the Greeble City Blocks 2. The price is absolutely fair, I think, and you can do a lot of stuff with these separate models. And so let's go back to DAS and use what we have in these packages for our front buildings. This one. Pretty cool. I especially like these three objects here on top. Now, the reason why we go into DAS 3D is I just want to show how to properly export these objects. Now, in your folder, in your project folder, you should always have a separate folder for the objects just to keep it all clean. And load all or save or export all your objects into that folder. And all the materials that come with this object will be saved into this folder as well. Now these are the settings I'm using. I cannot explain all of these or what all of these what most of these do, but what is very important is to collect the maps. That means the textures that are used for this object or for the objects you want to export. And what I use for scale is 1.2%. That's not super accurate when creating or when exporting for view, because as you probably know, every 3D tool, when you import stuff, handles scale differently. But I found 1.2% to be a good value to work with. Now let's import this object. And well, it's quite tiny. Maybe I should raise my percent value in DAS. Anyway, let's move it up here and rotate it. Not what I wanted. Let's try this. Okay. We don't want these foreground objects to cover our scene completely. They are just there to give you or give the viewer an entry point of sorts. And still a little too large. There. And we can also see that there are a couple of cameras. And what I generally always do is to create a separate camera for working. So we have a final main cam that is the scene cam we use for the final render. And there's one camera that is used to navigate around in the scene. And let's just take a look. And we can immediately see that the highlights are much too strong. And to reduce them, we just go in, right-click on the material, and edit all materials. Now, here we can already see 100%. That's far too much. And let's try this. And what it does now is to apply the settings we are adjusting here to all materials of this object. And now this should look a little bit better. Look. Yeah, it's less shiny, less bright. And something else we can do is to go into the material by double-clicking the object, into the object by double-clicking the object and reduce the smooth mesh. And what we do here is when light hits the object and it's at a value of 80 degrees, shadows and highlights and all this stuff becomes smoothed out. And that's something we don't actually want for our industrial building right here. We want this to be hard edged and yeah, not too soft. All right. Let's compare. You can see right here these highlights are smoothed out quite a bit, and when we have them not so smooth, you can see that these edges are very hard. And depending on what you want to do with the objects, of course, you can go with higher smoothing values. But for our buildings in this scene, we don't actually want that. Now, that's how you import these objects into view properly. Sometimes when you import these objects, it can happen that the bump maps or the bump value is far too high. So the value I generally use is 1001, 0.001, and that creates a very smooth bump map for the object. Maybe too smooth for some cases, but that's what I generally go with, especially with objects I export from DAS. Okay, and there we have our first building. Let's try another one. Number 23. And let's export this one as well. Now these objects aren't very very high polygon count objects, so it's fairly easy to use and not too heavy on your resources. But they are definitely good enough to go in and work out some additional detail in Photoshop later then. Now let's try to make its size the same as the other one. And let's rotate this one. Try that. And again, now you might wonder why these materials don't update up here. I deactivated this because every time I click on an object or change something on an object, this display of the material updates. And I want to avoid that since it eats away some of your CPU power, and sometimes it probably causes some unwanted behavior of Vue, especially crashes and stuff. So to minimize the danger of a crash during this presentation, I deactivated the automatic material updating. So that, by the way, can be changed right here. Disable automatic material preview rendering. And yeah, just to give you an overview of my usual settings, that's generally what I use when I create my images. Now, one important thing that I just saw, when you have very, very high polygon objects, once you click on objects and this show wireframe on selected objects thing is active, it can eat quite a substantial amount of power because Vue has to display all these fine lines, and to avoid that, just deactivate this option that every object is displayed with a wireframe. Now there are situations where this is definitely helpful, but sometimes it can have quite an impact on your performance in Vue. Okay. Now these are the general preferences. And of course, we have to keep in mind that these settings are for a machine with 32 gigabytes RAM and a 4 gigabyte video RAM graphics card. Okay, you got the generals too? Okay, okay. 32 gigabytes are definitely enough to create some really cool stuff. But when you want to go with very high polygon heavy objects, it's definitely not bad to have more. Or especially when you work with objects that are photometric scanned objects. That means objects that are created from photographs. That's a technique where you shoot like 100 different photographs of a rock, for example, every angle covered, and you have tools and programs that read these photos and create 3D objects of that rock you photographed, and will use the photo image data that you have there for the texture as well for the rock, so you can create some really natural looking assets. And let me just show you what I mean. There is a company that's specialized in this stuff. Maybe you've heard of this. And these guys create objects via photometric technique. And these rocks here, for example. And the models themselves aren't very very heavy when it comes to polygon count, but the materials are very heavy, especially when working with 8K resolution. And you not only have the texture itself, you have the bump mapping, you have the specular map, you have the shadow maps and ambient occlusion and everything you can have there. Download settings. Displacement, gloss, normal map, normal bump, roughness, specular. All these maps, when in 8K resolution, eat up a lot of memory. And for especially that kind of object with these kind of textures, it's not wrong to have at least 64 gigabytes of RAM. Otherwise, you will fill up your memory in literally no time. So we have at least 20 minutes left. Correct? Okay. So let's go back to these buildings. We have another one imported here. Let's switch back to our working cam. And trust me, I worked with these photometric objects in a couple of projects of mine, and it's really a pain, especially if you want to lay out a complete scene with these objects. It's really hard on 32 gigabytes. Okay, here we have our second building. We can already see that the bump maps are far too heavy. So let's go in here as well and edit all materials again. Bump maps to 0.001. Highlights again a little lower. And for the final render, or when you see something you're not happy with, you generally tend to go back into the scene or into these objects and change the appearance of these textures to make it all look the way you want. Okay, this looks much smoother now. In this building as well, smooth mesh angle 80 degrees is a little too much. So let's go down to 30 to give it, much like the other building, a harder edge. And it's still a little too high. And let's take a look. And yeah, Mark, you're completely right. These photometric objects or photogrammetry created objects, I don't know the exact technical term right now, are definitely more thought for close-up objects in the scene, and they look fantastic. They really look fantastic. So that's our second building. Now let's go back to the main camera. And I think they are still a little too large. Okay. Now we have one more for these front objects, and that's this one. And I really like these two, I don't know, cooling towers or whatever these are. Again, export using the correct name. And all the materials, of course, will go into the same folder, into the maps folder, for all the materials for all these objects. So you have it all together. That's very good and very handy. And there's our third one. Align it with the other ones. Turn it. Yeah. Now we have some free space right there. That's where we just create a copy of the just imported object. And a third one. All right. Now we select all three of these objects, go to edit all materials and fix the bump mapping here as well as the highlights. Now we have a hole right there. Let's see if we can fill that up. Now we want to recreate the setup of our final image here. So if it's not 100% accurate, that's okay, to show how it's done. So let's just do a quick test. And that starts to look like something. At least with the foreground right there. Now what we haven't done with our three copies is to adjust the smooth mesh individually. All right, that's basically our front setup. Now in the final scene, I have added some people to give all this a little bit of scale, and that I will explain in a upcoming segment. But the models I used for these people are from Dosh Design and are very low polygon people. I mean, very low res, but very helpful, especially if you just want to suggest some scale in your scene and just want to put in some reference, so people understand how to read the image and the scene properly. So that's the front elements, and to round out this first part of the two webinars, I want to add some additional detail to these buildings. And for that, I have a package of free assets that you can, it's not by me, not made by me, but you can download it for free on Gumroad. And there's some really cool stuff there. These are not textured, but they are free and a lot of fun to play around with. And we will use some of them in our scene. Sure. Whoops. Yeah, I can suggest just to download this stuff and play around with it. It's really cool. So now these low poly people, of course, are not free, unfortunately, and they cost quite a bit. But I bought a package from them a couple of years ago, and I'm constantly using them in my scenes to suggest scale and give the audience a reference point to read the scene and the image. Now let me just check my notes here for a second. Any more questions? You can definitely use them. You can definitely try that. The problem with billboards is as soon as you change perspective, it's probably very easily visible that these are basically cutouts. I checked the DAS 3D shop today. There is a package with billboards of several people and all kinds of people, women, men, children, and all that stuff. All these billboards come with versions in different perspectives, so that could work. But as soon as you deviate with the perspective of your camera, it can easily fall apart, I guess. So 3D objects, complete 3D objects of people is probably the best way to go. So adding some additional detail. Now we go into Kit Bash territory, and here are a couple of objects I selected, or these are the objects created in the scene. And now where's the one I'm looking for? This one. Okay, let's just drag and drop it into the scene and let's see what happens. Far too big again, but that's fine. Now we have an area right here in these parts where some additional detail wouldn't hurt. So let's just move this in there and place it properly. And some of these objects have some of these objects are mapped, so there are different areas of the object that can be textured in different ways. Some of the objects don't have that. That's a little unfortunate. But the objects that have these additional maps, let's just apply one. Something like, let's use Chrome. Switch to our working cam. In there and have a look at it. Okay, that's far too reflective. Reduce that. Probably still too reflective. Oh, that's fine. Let's go with that. Now again, create a copy of that and move it over there. Main cam. And we have filled up these areas down there a little bit with some additional detail. Let's try another object. Let's try this one. Ah, damn. Now I moved my camera. Not so good. Switch back to my working cam. Object. Let's try something for these areas. Damn it. Create copy here. Mirror it and place it there. Now something similar we will use for our train later. And yeah, well, this is just for demonstration, how you can quickly add some additional detail to the scene. Let's create a copy of those, move them over here. Check our main cam if we need another one. No, probably not. And well, let's try another copy and move it over here. So we have some additional detail right there. Now, let's try something crazy and render this a little bit bigger. archive3d.net is a very good site. So yeah, let me just try something with an additional object. Yeah, that's the one I'm looking for. Make it a little bit smaller. Now I use the drop feature that is down there. That will drop your object on top of whatever object lies beneath it. Sometimes I'm struggling with this drop object feature because it lands on areas I don't want it to land. But in this case, nothing was in the way, and then it works absolutely fine. Check this out in detail. Oh, let's try test render. And we have filled this area as well. So the objects in these in this asset package, this free asset package, can be used quite good for filling up empty areas or for areas that you think need additional detail. And this basically covers the front buildings. And the next step would be to add the hero building or our scene buildings that we have in throughout the landscape. There we won't cover every single building, but I have picked out a couple of buildings to explain how it's done. And then that's the point where we will also talk a little bit about composition of the scene. And that's the first thing we will do tomorrow.